Good afternoon, good evening to everybody here in the audience in Washington at AGSI Central or joining us on the web. I'm Doug Silliman, the president of the Arab Gulf States Institute, and I'm thrilled today to be starting the program, The Fluid Gulf, Framing Multicultural Heritage Through Film. I'm also thrilled to say that this is a collaboration between AGSI and the Middle East Institute, and we hope that there will be more similar collaborations in the future. And I want to introduce our first speaker, the Vice President for Arts, Culture, and Communications at the Middle East Institute, Kate Seelye. Kate, please.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Ambassador Silliman, and it is such a delight to be here, sharing a platform with three very talented academics to talk about film in the Gulf. And I want to thank Kristin, Diwan, and AGSIW for inviting MEI to be part of this program. There are not many Middle Eastern institutes that do culture in Washington, and certainly MEI and AGSIW are among them, so it's great to be partnering. I do hope we can do more in the future together. And I, for one, am very excited to hear about the genesis of film in the Gulf, from the arrival of theaters to the production of the first Gulf-made films. And of course, that's the focus of the book that we're going to be discussing today, Reorienting the Middle East, Film and Digital Media, where the Persian Gulf, Arabian Sea, and Indian Ocean meet. It was recently published by Indiana Press and co-edited by AGSIW visiting scholar Alia Yunis. Now, a lot has been written about Arab film in general, not so much about the Gulf. And the book is a series of very eye-opening essays about the many diverse players who helped develop this cultural sector from the early 20th century onwards. But before we talk about film in the Gulf, I would love to just say a little bit about film in the Middle East in general. And it's sort of assumed that Hollywood got to the Arab world early on and filmmaking followed, but actually Egypt had its first film screening in 1896. That was followed in 1908 by the establishment of 11 film houses around Egypt. By the 1920s, Egyptian directors were making their own films, and by the 1950s, Egypt had the world's third largest film industry. It's really an incredible story. And it wasn't just in Egypt, but in Algeria in the 1960s, there was a very active film sector. After the revolution, the country invested heavily in filmmaking to sort of change the narrative about the country. And not only did they invest in filmmakers, but they set up cinematheques and film clubs all over the country, from little villages to big cities, to develop a film viewing public. So really a fascinating history of film in the Middle East in general. But flash forward decades later, and the emphasis has shifted, of course, to the East, as Arab Gulf countries have invested their dollars in massive film festivals and in film funds to lure Western attention and interest. And of course now, Saudi Arabia, where cinemas have long been banned, has gotten into the sector in a very, very big way, which I hope we'll talk about today. So lots going on in the Gulf, which is why this is such a timely topic to be discussing today. So just a quick background on our speakers. In addition to being the co-editor of Reorienting the Middle East, Alia Yunis has taught film and heritage studies at NYU Abu Dhabi and Zayed University in the UAE for the past 14 years. She combines teaching and scholarly research with a background in filmmaking, journalism, and creative writing to publish extensively on Gulf heritage and media. She's also a published novelist, a PEN Emerging Voices Fellow, as well as the director of several documentaries. She's being joined by Samhita Sunya, who is an associate professor of cinema at the University of Virginia, as well as the director of graduate studies at UVA's Department of Middle Eastern and South Asian Languages and Cultures. Her interests span world film history, sound studies, feminist historiography, and more. Samhita completed her first book, Sirens of Modernity, World Cinema via Bombay, published by Cornell Press in 2022. And she's also programmed films for the Virginia Film Festival and the Shenandoah Film Collaborative. And last but not least, our moderator today is Kristin Smith-Diwan, Senior Resident Scholar at AGSIW. Her current projects concern generational change, nationalism, and the evolution of Islamism in the GCC countries. So thank you, ladies. And now over to you, Kristin.
Thank you so much, Kate, and I'm just delighted that we do have this partnership and these great relations continue with the Middle East Institute, and we admire that all the work that you do over there and really appreciate and enjoy all the time the beautiful exhibits that you have in the Least Institute as well. I see Lynn here, and y'all just do a fabulous job. And so I really do see us as kind of partners, as expanding this conversation about the Gulf beyond the normal, things that we normally look at there, to bring in these other elements. We at AGSIW are having a bit of a film month, I would say, here in April. We're delighted to be having this more intellectual and scholarly conversation about film and digital media in the Gulf. Earlier this week, we partnered with the Smithsonian and the National Asian Museum to screen a Saudi film, Mandub. And later this month, we're also going to be sponsoring through the General DC Film Fest another Saudi film, Hajan. So we're really pleased to be able to bring these to a Washington, DC audience, and more than that, to have this deeper conversation about both the history of film and the promise of film and the future of film and digital media in the Gulf. So we're also delighted because, as Kate mentioned, Alia Yunis is a visiting scholar with us here. We really want to celebrate the work that she's been doing, especially the publication of this really fascinating edited volume. And I have to say that her work in this field, as you heard, is quite extensive and varied, but also on this particular topic goes even beyond this book. And I know, Alia, that we discussed that this project, a broader project, included both this edited volume that's just come out, but also a double journal issue as well that was also published, that Samhita also published her research in. And I think that's really interesting. It shows that you've developed a very broad scholarly community around these issues that you wanted to engage in on Gulf film. So I was wondering if you could start by just telling us a bit about the genesis of this project. Of course, it's called Reorienting the Middle East. There's clearly something that you wanted to shift in the way that we were looking at film and the way that film comes out of the region. Can you just tell us a bit about those goals?
So basically, we started this idea, Dale Hudson, who's in Abu Dhabi right now, and I, well, let's have a conference about film and digital media in the Gulf, because it's always told through this framework of Dubai started the film festival in 2004 and then film was born, and it's not true. And it's also, it boxes the Gulf as a place that is just the Gulf. So, oh, it was off. Okay. And so reorienting, we meant to look at the idea of, so in academia now, and I'm not going to make this an academic talk, but there's a tendency to look at the Middle East no longer as using that word Middle East, so because that's a colonial word, and because it's the Middle East of what? Or the Far East of what? So all those words were colonial. So we're trying to switch away from that. So now it tends to be called Southwest Asia. So we say Southwest Asia and North Africa to speak about the Arab world now. Or the Arabic-speaking world. And there's a greater understanding when it comes to the Gulf specifically that it's very, very tied with South Asia. And to deny that connection because that's a non-Arab-speaking part of the world denies pretty much the entire history of the Gulf. So that's the reason for the title, Reorienting the Middle East. And also Africa, the ties to Africa and the whole Arab world, but specifically the Gulf, is also a narrative that's often deleted, and so and is very fundamental to the forming of the Gulf. So that's the reason we chose this word, reorienting the Middle East, because it's a different way of looking at it. And when we look at film, you can look at film that way also, that none of these films happened within the Gulf by a bunch of people from the Gulf only. They are a reflection of what the Gulf is, this fluid place. So rather than to always think of things as nation states, to think of them as part of arenas, that's an academic term, and then or spaces that people converge, not just because of national borders. So
And I think you referred, in fact, in the book and drawing upon some of that research of this sort of like the Gulf as being more of a meeting zone, actually. And there was some fascinating comparisons with the Caribbean as maybe another area where you see a lot of different cultures kind of combining.
Yeah.
And I'm just wondering kind of how fruitful you saw some of these comparisons and undertaking the work.
Yeah, there's, I mean, we were looking at other places where there's more recognition. The Caribbean is glissant, which is, and Franz Fanon, that crowd. That was, and it was a way of looking at it, of the Caribbean as not these little islands, but that they're engaged with each other, and that sort of, yeah. So that's one of the, but it wasn't only that one. There's other, Nigel Green, I think, is the one who did arenas. So looking at areas as arenas rather than countries,
Yeah.
you know.
So then you're not stressing the borders as much and looking more at the connectivity. So I'm eager to kind of hear how that came out then in your study of film and how that makes us think about kind of the history of film coming out of the region differently. I know that a lot of the work you did when I looked at all of the different scholars in the volume, some of it is a lot of sort of historical excavation, right? And kind of using this new lens to look into this history and see what you find. Can you tell us, just starting, about some of the earliest films from the Gulf region? I mean, where did we really get our start when we're talking about digital media and film in the Gulf?
Yeah, that is actually kind of interesting because it changes what we think of as a film as well. So the earliest films of the Gulf were made by the housewives of the, and I'm using the term that was used then, of the colonial officers that were in the Gulf at the time, and particularly in Bahrain. So they recorded a lot in the process of recording their daily lives or the arrival of a sheikh somewhere or something. They were recording the daily lives there. And most of those films are archived in the UK in various archives that are not generally accessible to the public, but we have seen several of the films, and they are really fascinating. And you understand how the British also looked at the Gulf from those films, from where these women were positioning the camera and what they thought was worth filming. So, but then the real big push comes with oil in terms of the oil companies. So Aramco, BP, the French company, they were really the big filmmakers, the first filmmakers, because they wanted to create a narrative about the Gulf that would suit the production of oil. So they really emphasized this idea of these people who had been locked in the desert for thousands of years, and then they emerge out of this desert and become these multimillionaires overnight. And that narrative played in so many of the oil films. And I thought I would show one from Abu Dhabi. It's a little later than some. These films go back to the discovery of oil. But I'm showing you one that was made for Sheikh Zayed in Abu Dhabi because it kind of shows that theme of a man emerging into modernity and taking his tribe with him. So if I can do the tech of this, let's see how I do.
And this is a clip from the film Farewell Arabia?
Farewell Arabia.
Do we call them films? Are they actually films?
This is a
or?
full-on documentary. So this
full-on
only
documentary,
It's
okay.
50 minutes, but I'm only going to show you a couple of minutes. And it was made in 1968.
And it was produced by who?
It was actually produced by an American company, an Australian company, and also a British company together. So, and I am going to, Kiana, don't.
At the wheel of this car is a man torn between two worlds. He's an Arab sheikh who was born in an old Arabia and will die in a new one. He worships Allah, loves the desert, and is one of the richest men in the world. His name is Zaid. Zaid rules a little kingdom in Arabia called Abu Dhabi. 20,000 people in a stretch of sand and salt flats about half the size of Denmark. To the tribesmen who follow him everywhere, he's the undisputed boss. His forefathers ruled the desert from the back of a camel. He rides it in a limousine. But he remains, as they were, the center of tribal life. He's the man you serve, the man you hunt with, and the man you fight for. Above all, he's the man who leads. Wherever Zaid goes, his men go too.
So they all follow that trope, and that not only mapped what the films were, it would map actually how those countries define themselves. So if you look at the early promotions of the Gulf countries, it was always that idea that we came with our tribe when oil came and we built this nation, and that there had really been nothing there before. And that denied a lot of history, especially the maritime history. And so a big part of looking at these films again is to see that they gave a colonial narrative of the place that was actually also carried on by the leaders. And it was beneficial for them in this idea of nation building. So that was a big part of why these films served many purposes and still do. But that narrative in contemporary films is starting to be questioned.
Maybe, Samhita, I can bring you into the conversation. I know that in your historical examination, you found a lot of evidence of a lot more kind of multicultural productions that emerged from the Gulf. So we saw this kind of earlier history that came through the oil films and the petro films. If we talk about the broader project that you are trying to pursue, where do you see the entry of a lot of these different communities that we know are a big part of the Gulf today and the way that they connected across the Gulf?
Yeah, I'm so glad to be here because I think I've learned so much from the work Alia has done. I'm a film historian who's worked on similar things in terms of trans-regional histories of cinema. Though I think what's amazing about Alia and Dale's edited collection and work is how much it challenges us to think not only across borders, but also across media forms. So television, cinema, digital media, everything from, these like colonial wives, oh, I'm so sorry, it's okay. Colonial wives films to, colonial wives films to TikTok videos. And I can give you a little example, which is in the course of doing other research, actually here in DC, going through the 1970s Times of Oman newspaper, I randomly came across this like incredible story of a film that was made on location in Dubai. And we can talk about this a little more later, possibly. But I had never heard of this film, but the remarkable thing was that it was advertised as an Iran-Pakistan, Jordan co-production. And it turned out it was made by 3 expatriates who were just working in the Gulf. So thinking about the diaspora of labor. And at the same time, how a lot of this labor was central to media infrastructure. So there's this like quintessential image of the construction worker. But alongside that, there are also people like the newspaper editor of the Times of Oman was recruited from Pakistan. So there's all of this like media work that's happening that's involving people from everywhere. And the striking thing about the instance of this film is that it involved a kind of motley of Sri Lankan, Indian, and Pakistani cast and crew, was produced from the Gulf, shot almost entirely on location in Sri Lanka. And so on the one hand, there's this ambition, and they had named their production company International Brothers Limited. So there's this real commitment to this idea of this kind of radical collaboration. And it's interesting because as a film historian, this to me strikes me as the most South Asian film I've ever come across in terms of India, Pakistan, Sri Lanka together. And so even though that ambition was there, it kind of butts against sort of both workflows and policies where there's a tendency to often classify films by the director, and given that the director was Pakistani, it was thought of as a Pakistani film because those were also the most prominent stars, and because officially a ban on Indian films was in place in this moment of the early 80s, it was actually banned from import or like exhibition in Pakistan. So the film all but got completely lost. And again, we can talk about that later, perhaps, in terms of the wild goose chase and the attempt to track down this film.
And what was the subject, the main topic of the film?
Yeah, so it's a kind of slightly like underdog story about an artist trying to make it. There's a love interest, there are dance sequences, but in some ways it's a melodrama about the golden-hearted artist versus the very materialistic and greedy world. That's sort of very classic theme of many of these films.
And that's so interesting that basically to have all of these people work together, almost they had to go to the Gulf, which was a place where they could kind of interact in a way that you didn't see coming out of production in their own countries.
Yeah, or even that being the fact that the Gulf has been a place where for such a long time people have gone from so many different directions, because I guess it's not like these men went to the Gulf to make the film, but exactly as you said, they came into contact with each other there. And so as a kind of contact zone, which I know Alia's written about in her work, I think is sort of the key to understanding and looking out for these, I think, really exceptional moments. Like, it's hard to imagine that kind of cross-border production. And the title means the sun is also a
Maybe we can take a step backwards then, Alia, if you're ready for it. I thought you could talk to us a bit about the very first film that was directed by a Gulf Arab. So maybe in seeing some, I'm not sure if that production itself was prior, but in some of these interactions that were taking place, obviously they were starting to learn from this as well. Can you tell us a bit about that first production, which I believe came out of Kuwait? Is that right?
I mean, Kuwait is the leader in media, not now, but historically in the Gulf, in both TV and film. So the film we're talking about is Bahar, which was made in 1971, and it is considered the first. It's considered the first film made by a Gulf director. So there have been feature films made in the Gulf before. Actually, only one other one. By feature film, I mean a narrative fiction film, and it was Disney. Disney came at the invitation of the Emir of Bahrain to make a film that played on the Disney Channel in 1970, and it was about pearl diving to the story of a little boy. It was made for the children's channel that Disney had back then. But the first time a Gulf citizen came behind the camera, it was Khalid Siddiq when he did this film, Basya Bahar, or The Cruel Sea. And it's still considered by most film critics, historians, to be the best film that's ever come out of the Gulf in terms of a narrative film. He passed away 2 years ago. I was lucky to have a friendship with him in the last years of his life, and he was very proud of this film, but very protective of it. So what I'm going to show you now is a clip off the from the internet, which is not good quality, but it'll give you an idea. And he had studied in India. He studied film in India. He was from a pretty wealthy merchant family, but he defied his father's wishes and put his own money into making films. And he had made several short films before he made this one, but he was very influenced, for those of you that are film nerds, he was very influenced by Italian realism, and you'll see it at the moment. And I realized that most people have never ever heard of this film, but there's actually someone here that saw it in the theater in Kuwait in 1971, which I find quite incredible. That's Helen over there. So, I mean, I never, because...
There wasn't a lot to do in Kuwait at the time. It was a big deal to go to the cinema and see. I was talking to my mom, recollections about it. Yeah, pretty cool. Go ahead, sweetie. Thank you.
No, it's so you would have seen a better quality than this, but she would have seen a censored version of it, because there's a very graphic scene in it that's masterfully edited. It really is, and it was censored in Kuwait because it was pretty much about the rape of a woman, and he doesn't show the rape, of course, but the way he edited it's very hard to watch, and that was taken out of the version that was played in Kuwait. But I'm showing, and it also was one of the first films to recognize the pearl diving heritage, and it's about how dangerous that life was, and about how, this is the story of a father who lost his arm pearl diving and doesn't want his son to go into it, but the son is obsessed with marrying the girl from a wealthier family, and so he's determined to go pearl dive because that's the only way to make money. And for those of you that are kind of familiar with Gulf television, the stars of this are the two biggest stars to have ever come out of Kuwait in TV. So some of you may recognize them. And this is the first time they act in a film.
بعدين لازم أروح. إيش قلتي يا نورة؟ موافقة؟
ما أدري بس أنا خايفة.
إيش منك خايفة؟ هذا حالنا وحالهن. الكويت كلها كذي. ما لابد من السفر والغوص. ها؟ كنا واحد جاي.
يلا روح، أخاف يشوفونا.
ليش نخاف؟
أنا خايفة.
تخافين من الناس؟ ليش تخافين؟ ما علينا منهم فحرة. كنا أبوي اللي جاي. مع السلامة نورة.
ليك حتناشف شو فيها؟
لا ماكو شيء بس مستحيل شوي.
شو اللي خليك مستحي كذي؟
جوعانة وبي
If you ever get a chance to see it with in its full glory, you would be lucky. It's really well done film. And it stood the test of time. I mean, it has critics now because of the portrayal of the denial of some of the multiculturalism. He did a lot of good portraying women and a different history, but people criticize it for not addressing multiculturalism in Kuwait. But I think, given everything else, it's pretty remarkable work.
Did he go on to make many other films?
So he made one other film, and it's called The Wedding of Zayn, and it's based on a novel by Tayyib Saleh, who's the famous Sudanese writer. And it played in Europe in festivals, but it's pretty hard to find now. but it was also, he was part of a movement of pan-Arabism at that time, where they liked, there was a very strong feeling of the United Arab World, and there was a lot of films that came out at that time that were made across Arab countries, in multiple Arab countries at once, and that's an example of one.
So we've talked about the origins of film, or at least some of the earliest films by Gulf Arabs, and the Arab kind of collaboration that we saw there, and some of these earlier collaborations in South Asia. We've had even a look into Disney coming into the Gulf. But there's one other major intern besides Hollywood in the Gulf, and that's Bollywood. So I don't know, Samhita, I'm wondering if you could tell us, I know that you've investigated the role of the Gulf in distribution of Bollywood films. We know that there's a lot of, obviously, consumption of Bollywood films across the Gulf. But in these early days, you found an interesting connection of the Gulf and early distribution.
Yeah, I can say a little bit about this. So, just like I was mentioning that the film Suraj Bhi Tamashai, I wasn't setting out to look for that. I was actually preparing an article for Alia's co-edited special issue and looking through the Times of Oman, and just happened to stumble across that. So similarly, in my earlier work, which was on the kind of long 1960s period and how Hindi films got caught up and were actively, reflexively participating in sort of these heated debates of that period in terms of what makes good cinema. Is it artistic excellence? Is it, politically sound cinema? Is it what's meant to be entertaining? And it's hard for us to appreciate that in that moment in many parts of the world, not only in this Cold War period was there a sense of the question of the world being up in the air in terms of what would the world look like, but also in this very volatile moment in many parts of the world, it's sort of pre-television. So there's this centrality of cinema to organizing kind of media publics and public life in a really interesting way. And in the course of that project, I was doing a lot of research at the National Film Archive of India, looking at histories of distribution and regulation. And what was so striking was this tiny detail where I think unless you're an obsessive nerd about these things like us, like no one would even pay attention to this, which was there were these national film policy reports, Indian policy reports that were cataloging exports through the 80s. And so around the mid-70s into the 80s, there are these catalogs of like the government's attempt to sort of get in on regulating distribution and get in on attempting and failing to nationalize distribution. And in these lists of countries they were exporting to, you'll see like, Tunisia, Morocco, Nigeria, whatever, Oman TV. And this kept showing up and it was very strange to me. Why does it keep saying Oman TV instead of Oman? And this was an exception. Nothing else was showing up like this. So in looking into this more, what comes about was that this was an attempt on both sides for the state to kind of regulate media circulation. So on the side of Oman, there's this new television channel that's set up. You need content. So, let's make a deal to import Indian films, which, were popular anyways for television. Indian government on that side, it's like, this distribution circuit has gotten out of hand because it's mostly in the hands of independent distributors, and this distribution has ranged from everything from informal to illicit practices of film distribution. So for the Indian government, it's like, we can get in on, so then we can choose the films that are being sent over. But what's so fascinating about this moment is this attempt to exert kind of state control ends up becoming unwieldy in a new way, which is that apparently the Oman TV signal could be picked up in Pakistan. So then you start seeing these newspaper accounts that are so colorful, like the wind blew and surgeons left a patient half open to run because they heard Mughal-e-Azam, like a very classic Indian film, coming in. And like there are these tall tales of this, including a very colorful and kind of innuendo-filled account of how, you know, Pakistan's so crazy attempting to get Oman TV that in attempts to get a bride, grooms with the tallest antenna are the ones that that succeed. So there's really color. But what's so fascinating about those accounts is that the cultural value of these films far exceeds their economic value. And also, there's this way in which illicit modes of circulation or informal modes of circulation are sometimes assumed to have informal or illicit content. So there's this censorious impulse that's not necessarily from the content, but that's coming from this sense of the unruliness of the distribution itself.
That they were getting in on a secret that they weren't supposed to have, sort of idea.
Exactly, yeah. Yeah.
Well, let's talk more, move a bit closer to present day. As Kate kind of intimated in her introduction, the Gulf has clearly not historically been the center of Arab or Middle Eastern film production, but now it's really sort of striving to compete in that role, and it is to some degree succeeding and assuming this prominent place. So I'm wondering if we could talk a bit more about how it looks different. I mean, how does it look different the way that film has developed in the Gulf, or the way that it's developing in the Gulf, than it did in these earlier iterations? Kate already talked about the importance of Egypt, for example. The Gulf obviously has very different sort of strengths and I imagine weaknesses as well. So what does it look like, this current kind of pitch for the Gulf to be a center of production and distribution?
Yeah, it's really interesting. It's really interesting to watch, to see what's happening now. And I think, the Gulf was also the biggest market for the Egyptian films. So they had, I think a lot of people, Viola Shafiq wrote about this quite a bit, that they had a influence. The Egyptian industry was once here. It's not. It's here now in terms of volume and quality. And a lot of it in the 1980s when they ran out of money, in the 90s also, the Gulf was giving them money to make something called clean cinema. So to create these films that would be very G-rated, let's say, that were and that the women would be wearing hijabs even though they were inside their own homes, and things that were not at all what normal people would be doing. But it was this idea of creating, and they were getting more money for that, and there was a bit of a loss of the Egyptian cinema at that time. The quality of it went down. And then Abu Dhabi and I should say the UAE and Qatar really started it in around 2005 with the big fancy film festivals. But there was filmmaking happening before then without government support. So the big shift is government support. And for the UAE, the results are, if you look at the films made on their own without government support, they have of course the quality isn't as good, the cinematography is not as good, but the story is a little bit richer because they had nobody telling them, well, maybe you should do it this way. They were very independent films, and also films without much of an audience. But they had a whole different feel, and now you have very slick productions coming out of the Gulf. But as far as the UAE and Qatar go, not much that's come out has that appeal beyond the borders, because they've been very catered towards creating a national narrative rather than a really compelling story, and so that's hard to make an edgy film. The U.S. did it with the westerns, and I think they were trying to find a genre within that, and that was part of building the U.S. identity, was the idea of the final frontier and moving out. And now Hollywood is about space, so the same narrative exists, but in a different, without the desert. Now the desert is being helmed by the Saudis, and so that's the place to watch now, I think, because
Saudi Arabia?
Yeah, because Saudi Arabia had a lot of independent filmmaking. I mean, we can't ignore the importance of the internet and social media in opening it up, and digital, and film going digital. So all these people were making films at home, in groups and all, from starting in the 90s. But, when Saudi didn't even have their cinemas open, they were doing some of the most compelling short films and things that have ever been made in the Gulf, really, except for the golden age of Kuwaiti TV, that were really taking a critical look at the society. And of course, the most famous one are Telfaz 11, who are now doing major feature films with the support of the government. And so far, so good. I know we had Mandub last week, which is really good. It doesn't offend the government at all, but it's not making a government film. So it's a nice balance they're finding.
Yeah, and that's by the director Alia, who was one of the co-founders of Telfaz 11.
And I'm going to show you Telfaz's probably most famous video that kind of made them internet sensations. Probably a lot of you have seen it. I think it has 12 million views. So they started doing kind of these spoof ones, and Hisham also has gone out on his own. So he split from them.
Hisham al-Fakir.
Yeah. Oh, it has 17 million views. So I'll just play a little bit.
Hello, my name is Hisham Faghi. I'm an artist and social activist. I don't really listen to music, but while studying in the US, I heard a song by a Jamaican guy that really caught my attention. I decided to do my own rendition, with lyrics relevant to my culture, but without musical instruments. And now, with the help of some of my talented friends, I sing. No woman, no drive. No woman, no drive. No woman, no drive. No woman, no drive. Say, I remember when you used to sit.
So they started doing, but they found their own way of telling stories, with just their basic cameras or phones, and became huge internet successes. So now they have budgets and are making bigger films, and so that's a place to really watch to see what this transition has. But what's really interesting about Saudi is it has so many talented people that have been working all these years on their own. It's a large population. It's just and the larger the population, the larger a number of really creative people you're going to have. And so it's interesting to see where they're going to go, and what having a lot of government funding is going to do to the stories.
Yeah. And this certainly is an ambition of the current Saudi government. We can see they have a new Ministry of Culture. They have a new, their own now film festival, the Red Sea Film Festival, which they're trying to get very much international attention. And that's the other thing that I think came up in your book. One is the connections in the Gulf, of course, across these sort of borders, but there's also the global connections too. And I'm wondering if you could just say a bit more about how you think that outreach to reach a global audience affects the way that the films or digital media is produced. And I guess the film festivals, I know that you've written and had other people writing about that. might be one indication of that place of intersection and the film world. How do you think that's affected the films coming out of the region?
Yeah, we can both talk about this. There's a whole chapter in the book written by Kate Dickinson on it. But yeah, and there's another chapter by Christina on looking at two. And I'm going to use the example in that chapter, actually. So I think a lot of you have seen Wajda, right? The Saudi film that came out maybe 10 years ago now. So it all becomes about funding, who's funding the film. So that film was funded by a lot of European agencies, distributors, I should say, and producers. And so they dictated a lot of the narrative. That's not fair to her. I mean, it was her script, but they dictated how to position it and how to frame it. So it's a Western film. It has a Western language. So it's easily consumed in the West. Although there are, if you were to watch it, there are things in it that she goes deeper into her society and critiques it, but that's not what people were in the Western audience were seeing. You know, they were basically seeing the narrative of saving a Muslim girl, which some people had a problem with that trope again, but she has a lot of other elements in it. But that's what happens when there's outside funding also, right? That you cater, not just a Gulf filmmaker, any filmmaker has to cater to who's financing their film. So, and there's a lot of financing of Gulf films now because everybody's curious. So internally and also external funding. So that impacts it. I don't know, did you want to add something, Samhita, on that? Because there's a lot you can say about that. I mean,
and are you seeing any more of these reconnections then between these new Gulf filmmakers and I don't know, either Iran or South Asia or some of these other linkages?
in terms of production, using the UAE as the Gulf, but specifically, let's say the UAE, is as a location. It's used as a location a lot for Bollywood films that are using it as a location just as a place, not to read as Dubai, and also using it to read as Dubai because there's so many South Asians that live in the Gulf. So you have a lot of that. In fact, the other kind of film I like to look at, and which I think Abu Dhabi has been more successful with than it has in any other genre of filmmaking, is the tourism film. And they've done a really good job with tourism films. And, you know, the biggest market for tourism in the UAE is India. And so obviously wealthy Indians that, and so they actually, I think I will show you this clip if I can. Shah Rukh Khan, who's the most famous actor in the world and the star of all things Bollywood, they hired him basically to run a whole campaign in Dubai. And he also owns a place in Dubai. He loves Dubai. But if you look at this, look for how many. Can I show a 2-minute clip?
Yeah, please.
I think I have it up here, Shah Rukh Khan. We might have to see some. And I hope I have the right one up. But try to see how many Emiratis you can see or Arabs you can see in the film.
This is my Dubai. Come with me.
Those were the two Emiratis you'll see in the film. And so it's, but obviously they know, very clearly. So it's an interesting film to look at because it gives ownership of the city not to the local population. It gives ownership of the city to him, and because he says it's my Dubai, and it's very catered towards bringing in the tourists, the wealthy Indian tourists, and also completely invisible from it are the working class in South Asians that live there, which are a huge part of the population, but they don't get to meet him. So I don't know. Did you want to add anything?
No, yeah, this campaign was really fascinating because I think it had like the hashtag Be My Guest or Shah Rukh Khan as like the brand ambassador to Dubai, which, some academics have written about this, like Aiwa Ong, where this idea of sort of citizenship or this idea of belonging being contingent on the ability to invest in places. So the way that someone like Shah Rukh Khan as a non-citizen can belong to Dubai or claim Dubai as his own, because of just like others we see, there's this very multinational sort of milieu in Dubai, but what they all share is a kind of claim to not citizenship maybe in the paper sense, but a sense of belonging to a place because of their access to capital, which I think is interesting. And I can just add that everything Alia was saying just now about cinema in the Gulf and all this work to me as a teacher is really helpful because I think it helps avoid either extreme of, on the one hand, thinking about histories of cinema in terms of like standard narratives of the age of cinema was earlier, now it's the age of something else, like digital media, internet, whatever. And that now like certain places in the world are just belated in terms of coming to cinema later. So challenging that on one end, and on the other extreme, the pronouncements that either cinema is dead or the cinema centrism of a lot of media studies that just like over focuses on the film at the expense of all. So when you kind of orient your theory or your approaches to studying and writing histories of media, I think that the Gulf and all the work that Alia has done is really helpful to say that like you can't make assumptions about either periodization or belatedness in any homogeneous way. So this is a perfect example where this tourism video is so embedded in formats like YouTube and platforms and social media, but is also very cinematic in this very transregional way, like a Bollywood star, and at a moment where there's so much investment in festivals in the Gulf and everything.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think that's like, we have a whole different way of looking at what is a film now.
Yeah. And that gives you a whole expanded research venue, too. I mean, because we're living in a completely digital, visual culture right now. I mean, if you see the way that we consume knowledge, it's often very much visual, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I wanted one more question. I want to make sure that we allow some time for questions. Those of you, obviously, I'll be coming to all of you here first, but if you are watching, you can put in questions on the chat if you're watching us as a webinar. So please go and put it in the Q&A function, and I'll be happy to look to those questions. While everybody's kind of thinking about what they want to ask our two writers and scholars here, though, we started the conversation about film festivals in the Gulf and talked about these kind of blitzy ones. But Alia, you co-founded what's now the longest running film festival in the Gulf. Do you want to tell us a bit about that and how you've been able to sustain it while all these other bigger ones and well-funded ones have stopped, actually?
I actually don't have anything to do with it anymore, but I did co-found it, and I ran it with Sasha Ritter for 10 years. So it's the Zayed University Middle East Film Festival, and in 2010, Rima Majid and Alia Al-Falasi were two students that wanted to do a capstone. And this is when there was crazy amounts of money coming into Abu Dhabi, from the Abu Dhabi, to do all kinds of events like festivals, anything to do with film. And these two girls were seniors, and they were like, you know what, we're going to do a film festival for our capstone. And I was like, you guys are crazy. But because I had worked in film festivals, I know how much work it is. But there was the moment in the UAE where everything was like, no, if we want to do it, we're going to do it. And so, okay, then we're going to do it. And somehow we did it, and we got films from the region, like not just the Gulf, the whole Arabic-speaking world, and now it also includes Iran and Turkey after a couple of years, not just because we consider that the greater region. And it's one of the few platforms that young filmmakers had a chance to show their work. There's very little chance in the Arab world, especially from the deprived. So for people coming from the poor Arab countries, it was a really big deal to get to play their films there, and for the Emirati students who would organize it, it was a chance to also promote the UAE, which was a big part of it, and to be the ambassadors of their country and to do the whole thing of the red carpet and all, which, they all loved at that time, and to be the baby DIF and the baby ADFF. And it carried on. It's now, I think, 2010. So since 2010, it's been going on. It's really catered, and it's really interesting to watch because the strongest films come out of the North Africa and the Levant still, but in terms of story, but you really see a lot of stuff coming out of the Gulf too that would never have a chance to play anywhere else if it didn't have these kind of small festivals to play, because there's really no community type festivals left, or any festivals at all when it comes to the UAE. And Qatar has done a pretty good job of keeping one community, and Abu Dhabi has one also in Al Ain, but it just served a purpose to be pan-Arab also. I think that was interesting for the students to see what people in other places do. And the UAE is always a shock to the other students. So, because most of them have never had the money to travel anywhere. And so.
Oh, the students that they're bringing in, the
filmmakers.
filmmakers.
Like we had a Palestinian student, and he won for Best Narrative Film, and he was crying in the theater. And Sasha asked him, why are you crying? What's wrong? Are you okay? And he said, I've never been in a movie theater in my whole life, and I've never seen my film on a big screen. And then the Emirati students were overheard this and all, and they're like, you've never been to a cinema? And they took him to a cinema for the first time in his life. And also it gave all these opportunities for the students coming from, because we paid for their travel and everything. So
wow, so he was making the film, but had only seen it like on a small screen.
Yeah, and he'd never even been in a theater in his life, because what theater would there be where he was coming from the West Bank? Yeah.
Well, thank you so much. I want to open the questions to all of you. I think we have somebody who's going to come around with a microphone just so we can capture it. Yeah, Will back there has one. So please, you can see that they have very broad knowledge in visual media across film and history. So take a shot. Raymond?
I'll start because I'm right by the microphone. Thank you both, all three of you, all four of you, for a fascinating conversation. I'm curious about one thing, and maybe we can bring kind of that historical connection of South Asia and the Gulf to the modern day or the present day. And if you can both comment on the phenomenon of the goat life movie that's kind of breaking records in the Gulf, but it's banned in all countries except the UAE, right? So it's for those who you can say more, but it's a movie. It's an adaptation of a novel about a Indian worker who's kind of stuck in Saudi Arabia, right?
Yeah.
Just curious about.
I'm gonna let you take. I haven't seen it. You haven't seen it either. You would be more knowledgeable than me. Okay.
Yeah, I mean, this is adapted from a literary text by a writer from Kerala, which is a state in southwestern India, and I haven't seen it yet, but reading about it, I think, so the only thing that I can comment on now is I look forward to learning more about what's been happening in its circulation and, of course, watching. But I think that instance helps us, again, really focus on the heterogeneity. Like, even when we say an Indian in the Gulf, or sometimes that assumption, or even like South Asian media in the Gulf is Bollywood, which is the Bombay-based Hindi language industry. Shah Rukh Khan's part of it. But perhaps the biggest diaspora, at least from South Asia and the Gulf, are those from Kerala who speak the language Malayalam, and that's its own sort of film industry, and featured in the collection and in the special issue, and sort of other work that's coming out on these trans-regional circuits. There's a lot of really interesting work on Malayalam cinema, and because such a huge number from that region works in the Gulf, where even its economy is significantly propped up by remittances. So just an instance of now like a very visibly circulating media object phenomena that comes out of that is like a good reminder to remember that heterogeneity of both the diaspora and, when we think South Asia, all the languages and people that it encompasses.
Yeah. And we share a mutual friend that told me she is from Kerala, and she's like, why isn't anyone writing about this? This is so important. And so, I mean, it is like, I don't even know how you're so aware of it, but that's good. But that it's like this thing that's just this slow-moving phenomenon, or fast-moving, actually. Yeah, it's really interesting to watch.
And I guess, like you said, there's a really large population to appeal to, so maybe it does speak to an audience that it really resonates in some way. Interesting. Other questions?
Thank you, and thank you for that fascinating discussion. Alia, I just wanted to pick up on your discussion about the film festivals in Abu Dhabi. Help me to understand kind of the commitment of the UAE and Qatar to film festivals, film production, film funds. It feels as though, like, as Saudi takes off, both of those countries are retrenching. Because I remember in the mid-2000s, there was the Dubai Festival, the Middle East Festival in Abu Dhabi, there was Tribeca, and then all of that sort of went away, and then there was Image Nation, or however you pronounce it, and then that sort of disappeared. What is going on in the UAE around film and its priorities, and have they just sort of given up, or are they just focusing on tourist films, or help us to understand that shift in priorities there?
Yeah, that's actually a really interesting question, and something that everyone there talks about. So the UAE had two paths, or several paths, but two key and interrelated paths towards diversification from oil, and one was media and one was tourism. And of course they overlap, as we've just seen. But the tourism has, as we all know, gone really well. And the film festivals served the tourism agenda as well, because all these famous actors from all over the world were brought in for these festivals, and they went home, and also you got to go to Dubai, you got to go to Abu Dhabi. So it served that purpose. But it goes back to what I was saying about and they've really hosted a lot of Hollywood productions and Bollywood productions, and actually so that was another way of looking at film, is to be a location site. But internal production, part of it is, there's not a lot of funding going to independent filmmakers that through Imagination. It's more now focused to location shooting and corporate filmmaking, and even maybe a little bit more looking at animation. And there's a lot of interest in animation and a lot of interest in gaming. So the shift is kind of shifting to that kind of media.
Is that for political reasons or just economic?
I think there's political reasons for it, for sure. And also I think financial reasons, like it hasn't been that lucrative because the productions haven't been that wow. So, yeah.
It's interesting, though, because as Kate mentioned, it does seem like Saudi Arabia is really trying to take up that position right now, both in terms of their interest in having big film festivals that draw stars and stuff into Saudi Arabia to start to give it kind of more credibility and to draw more eyes onto the kingdom. to get that kind of buzz. And then at the same time also funding production of films, and I think to perhaps serve a strong role for them in terms of highlighting some locales and things like that they want to get attention to, like the beautiful Ula location, that kind of thing. We know we have a new film coming out that's going to be very much filmed there. So maybe it's just Dubai and felt like they've stepped beyond that. I don't want to go back to stages. You said we shouldn't think of it in terms of stages, but I'm wondering.
Maybe like that's not our path forward. Yeah. And maybe also Saudi Arabia has the benefit of looking at what Qatar and the UAE could have done differently. So and I'm sure, and if you look at the production, the people working in production and festivals in Saudi, they're the very same people that were working in the UAE and in Qatar. They've just been shifted over. So it's the same cycle of people, working in these venues and places. So you hope they're learning from their mistakes too, I think. Oh, look at that. Okay.
Right. So I guess our next panel will have to be on gaming. It seems to be where a lot of the creative energy is going, and money, apparently. Another question? Nada?
Hello. Thank you all for your really interesting insights and kind of contextualizing all of the developments that we see today in the region. But I was thinking, since we've just come out of Ramadan, if you could talk a bit about the significance of Ramadan series in the region, kind of shifting away from cinema into television, maybe why Ramadan specifically, what about it kind of spurs, annual series and shows that are 25 seasons long, anything else that you might think is interesting about that?
So I think that's a really good question, and it's a field that's not looked at that much. The idea of series as being part of Ramadan started with the satellite TV. So in the late 80s, when all the satellite channels started coming in, and at that time, you had three powerhouses of series made especially for Ramadan. You had Kuwait, you had Syria, and you had Egypt. But really it was Syria and Kuwait in terms of high quality. And there was and high quality in terms of story also, I mean more than production. And I think when we talk about multiculturalism, that period is often called the golden age of Kuwaiti TV. And it's because it was TV that wasn't afraid of looking at Kuwait as a multicultural place, a multinational place, and a place that had so many different people and so many social classes, and it would make fun of all of that. And those videos, those TV series are still huge hits on YouTube now because they've found their way there for like a third generation. But now there's a tendency not to be critical. We've gone sort of towards the melodramas, so that's why. And then there's the generational shift, right? People don't sit at home and watch TV anymore, although that Ramadan series thing still has a feeling for it, but the quality of the series has really shifted to these melodramas, and now I would say Lebanon is very strong in them, especially if you like high drama and all. But but I'm not so sure if the don't start on the Lebanese series; they're very addictive. But I think you're seeing less coming out of the Gulf. They're kind of flat. They're not super exciting. Egypt every now and then brings out a good one. So, I don't know if I answered your question, but yeah.
I've heard anecdotes about filmmakers kind of cutting their teeth and developing their chops through Ramadan serials in terms of, because you have to go so quickly that, I'm thinking in particular of Amr Gamal, a Yemeni filmmaker, who talked about how, after the war in Aden, it seemed sort of the worst time to realize this dream of, I want to make a film. But it was like, why not? Because of just the pace of the serials actually giving him and his crew the confidence of, we can actually do this, because that's such a fast-paced, sort of intense environment for writing, producing, directing, everything.
Yeah, and I think you can take more risks in TV because the budget is lower, so you can play around more. The budget on all those series is really low. And one more connection to the Gulf. After all of the tragedy of Syria, a lot of those Syrian productions have come to the UAE, and they are done on studio sets. So Bab el-Hara, which was a big one for decades, it now films in the UAE, and it's lost that edge of filming on the street in Damascus. And yeah, so, but yeah.
Yeah. We also do follow a lot of times, being interested in sort of the political messaging too. We look a lot to the Ramadan series, and Saudi Arabia in particular has been really kind of using those as these dailies to get messaging and to kind of establish the historical narrative in Saudi Arabia, kind of working through these kind of social dialogues and stuff to present a new positioning of where they want to see Saudi Arabia go. So that's been interesting to see that happening through the Silsilat. I think you had a question.
You just addressed it.
Oh, yeah.
Because you mentioned that, Alia, that the early films, kind of colonial narrative, served the leader's interests. So I was wondering the extent to which today, some of the Gulf countries are, I'm sorry, should I repeat it? Whether today we are seeing an expansion in the number of films or series that are looking back at the earlier history, trying to recover the history maybe that was lost in the earlier films. And I guess you've addressed it partly because you said Saudi Arabia is trying to do that.
Yeah.
So I don't know if you could speak on that.
I mean, so far they haven't done a great job of it. Like, I know, like, Saudi Arabia did King Faisal, and that wasn't, like, really well done. I mean, I don't want to say it wasn't well done, but it didn't do him justice, I guess, to be, like, it was kind of watered down. And it's really hard to look back at history and do a biopic or something. So there's not a lot of self-reflection on the past yet. Yeah, the past is still being negotiated. So yeah, yeah.
Lynn?
Hi, thank you. I wonder if you can speak a little bit about the film education landscape, young people in the Gulf who want to learn and become filmmakers and get into this. Do, your fabulous research and what you both spoke about and the origin and evolution of, film in that area, do these things trickle down, get discussed to the extent that because a lot of those young people as well are pushing against sort of dominant narratives that are pushed by governments or high capital. And does this trickle down, in play a role in the education and the formation? And
yeah, I taught there for a long time, so I guess I'll have to take this one. Yes, there's not a lot of formal education in media. There is some, and in film specifically, some. It's growing every day, but the interest level of the students varies. You have ones that don't want to rock the boat. So obviously the status quo is great, so why rock the boat? There's that way, and then there's others that are like, but no, I want to say this isn't okay. So you have a mix of where they go. I have a lot of students that I taught now that all work in 2454 in Abu Dhabi or DCT. So they're working in media production and all. None of them could do it independently. I know there were a couple of students that were so talented and gifted and all, and they really wanted to do things, but it's very hard on your life socially. It doesn't fit into the society very well to choose this path, and for men and women, and because, the hours are weird and and then the issue of money, so it's not a path that's an easy one to take for them any more than it is for an American student, but they do like to discuss, and they do have a lot of critiques of things, and they have critiques of things that are being critical. They'll be against things that have been critical, and they'll also be critical of things that are just, pushing a narrative. So they are media savvy. There's no way they can't be in this day and age. Yeah. Yeah.
I can just quickly add that to me as a historian, a fascinating thing that I think endures to this day is in, places in the global south or so-called third world. I think what's historically fascinating is the omnivorousness of people interested in making films in terms of, in earlier decades and even now, the range of films that people who kind of come of age wanting to make films watch is so wide, from Bollywood films to sort of the European masters of art cinema to Ramadan serials. And I think that omnivorousness is actually really interesting as as a kind of like set of forms that I think ends up orienting filmmakers.
Yeah, I agree.
Since we were talking about political films, we had a question online about do you think cinema from Southwest Asia, North Africa is inherently political? Do films produced in these regions need to be political in order to express the identity of the Arab world? And how might we bring these kinds of films to a wider audience? Do they tend to be more political coming out of these regions?
Certainly, if you're talking about the Levant and North Africa, yes, of course, they're more by political I mean also looking at cultural problems, not just the governmental problems, but looking at cultural taboos or abuses or things like that. There is again less in the Gulf because it's I personally, as someone who also makes films, I don't think you can set out with a very specific agenda and make a good film like with that. I have this political message. It has to somehow be part of a narrative also, whether it's a documentary or fiction. But yeah, that's a hard question. I think everything is political for me. I don't know. I mean, but
I kind of want to jump off that question because my question was, the early filmmakers in Kuwait, the TV in Kuwait, were these art for art's sake? Are these individual visions? What was the intended audience? Now the modern Saudi investment in film from the government, are they making these for Saudis to see in Saudi cinemas? Is anybody in the Gulf looking to a South Asian audience, looking to an Asian audience or a European audience? Are these films for commercial success? What are the different motivations of the filmmakers that you have seen over the last, the 30 or 40 years history that you're talking about?
It's a great question because I think there's always a colonial mentality still. So there's always this idea that we're making a film that, gee, we hope they like it in France. But their real audience is South Asia. Like that would be the one. It's a huge population for one thing, and it's an audience that is culturally connected to them and historically connected to them, but not viewed as better than them, whereas there's still this idea that the West does it better when it comes to film. So I think there's more you'd want your film to play in Cannes, not so much you'd want your film to play in New Delhi. Do you want to add to that?
Yeah, I think it's an interesting question and maybe an unanswerable one as a historian, because I think there's always an interesting dynamic between, I guess the way you can put it is the politics of value on the one hand and the value of politics on the other. So to take the instance of The Sun is also a spectator, Suraj Bhi Tamashai. If I told you nothing about the film and just showed it to you, you would be like, what is this? It's boring, like it's cliche, it's not interesting. But hearing the story around it and the ambition, you then get a sense of its politics. Again, trying to buck trends of these sort of national sort of productions and this cross-border ambition that definitely had a certain politics. So I think before answering that question, it's sort of like asking the question, like, what are the political contexts that are informing a certain production? And, how is it negotiating that context where films that seem very apolitical on the surface could have a lot more going on sometimes.
I have a question, which would be another kind of visual presentation too in the arts. I don't know if you're aware of this, but they ask about the Tate Britain showing Farah al-Qasimi's film Nar, and they're showing it within an exhibition space rather than a movie theater. They're wondering if you have any comment on that or on the broader kind of intersection of the art world, I guess, and visual film as well.
I'm not going to talk about that exhibition specifically because I haven't seen it. But I do know that in the book we address that film is no longer film. So this is also a legitimate form of filmmaking. And it has a different audience in mind. This definitely has a Western audience in mind because it doesn't have many spaces outside of the Western world. It is filmmaking, I guess. Yeah, for me, that's not. I don't know. Do you have a different opinion on that?
I have to think about that. I mean, I haven't seen it, but I'm curious.
But we have a very interesting chapter in the book, not to promote the book, but by Beth Deridian. Here. By Beth Deridian. And she looks at that topic.
Okay. Excellent. Yeah, because I definitely, and if we look, I know that Nada and I are spending a lot of time in the art world too, and conceptual kind of visual film is a very huge part of it, right? Please.
Hi, sorry, I'm 5 hours late, so I hope you haven't already covered this. It's very Arab of me to show up so late. But I know, we've come a long way from, terrible movies like Not Without My Daughter, which wasn't even obviously Arab, it was Iranian, but it, painted us in a terrible light and all of this. So we've come a long way from there. And, a lot of, we're talking a little bit about censorship, how a lot of it is obviously, the Dubai PR machine, so on and so forth. It's illegal to say anything negative about Dubai, which we know if we've lived there. I guess my question is with, institutes and budgets like 2454 and all of that, and talking about, the young population, 70% plus, so on, endorsing them. I mean, is that just lip service, or are young people really encouraged to express themselves? Like with queer Arabs or all these other things we want to talk about that happen. I don't mean like scandals and, painting us in a negative light, God forbid, but just being honest and authentic about, real problems that happen, whether it's attempted suicide or being atheist or anything, negative like that, not just, being gay. And also, have you talked about Dubai Bling or not? And if so, what do you think of it? Thank you.
Yeah. How many people here have seen Dubai Bling?
Unwatchable.
but everybody watches it. I don't know. I mean, there's certain topics that are definitely just taboo in the Gulf. Religion and queerness; those are off the table. But other things are dealt with indirectly, like Samhita was saying. They're embedded in the stories, so it could be like a farcical comedy, but within it, you're seeing this the class differences that are not okay, or the way the maid is being treated, or all this. But it's embedded rather than let me tell you about this. So that's the cinema to watch. We do have a little bit about Iran in the book. Is Iranian cinema. They're the masters of getting in the messages without hitting you over the head with it and all of that. But certain things, like if you wanted to deal with religion, that would be a really you could try it, but not directly for sure.
Yeah, and a good example of this might be Gahim Felhind, Hell in India, this 2016 Egyptian comedy. It was like an Eid release. It looks very light, and from the trailer, even racist, but it ends up being a kind of complete homage to Hindi cinema, but is actually quite sharp, which doesn't seem to be the case because it's so over the top and it's comedy. Like, it even features a love story with a gorilla that's quite extended, but it's very, very, very sharp in the context of things like all the leaks that were happening under Sisi, the bureaucratic dysfunction, the crackdowns on queer communities, through actually that what seems so ridiculous and just absurd, the gorilla love story, but it's actually in really smart ways through, again, this like comedic genre that seems so silly and trivial, making actually a lot of really, really interesting commentary.
Yeah.
I was looking at some of the short films too. I mean, we were talking about Telfaz and 11 and talking about distribution. They have that arrangement now with Netflix, so you can see a number of Saudi films and short films, especially these short films there. And they do tend to be very dark. I've been quite struck by the subject matter that they're choosing, and it does address a lot of social kind of ills, domestic abuse and these sorts of things. So they do seem to have a hand to be able to look at things like that, actually.
Yeah. And I think, just to clarify, it's also important to make a difference between the Gulf in terms of these two topics compared to the rest of the Arab world on these topics. Yeah. So you see more. And again, it has to do with funding also. But I just want to say, I feel like we've said negative things a lot, but I just want to say that the Gulf is also a space of immense opportunity to to just meet all kinds of different people and think in all kinds of different ways. And yeah, okay, there's certain things you can't touch or you have to be smart about how you address them, but it's a great contact zone. You know, I don't think there, yeah, so.
Yeah. There was one last question, actually, that is a good way to close and expand that. They asked both of you, Alia and Samhita, what are your projections of how the mediascapes in the Gulf, in relation, both within the Gulf and in relation to the larger world, might change in the next 10 years? I mean, what are some of the trends that you see, and how do you think these relationships are going to be developing?
That's a hard one. I mean, I think that TikTok and other social media platforms are going to be the basis for TV series and film going forward. But I think film is increasingly an experience. So even in other parts of the world, you can't just make a small film. It's pretty tricky now. Films are like an experience because you're consuming media all day, as we said, and a lot of that those great ideas are coming from social media originally. So I see that. And gaming is just, yeah, something. There's so many distractions beside the idea of film and the sources of where that film would come. And just I have to say one more thing before we close. I'm here and Samhita are here, but there's so many people that are in this book, but there's the most important person that I did not mention is Dale Hudson. So I want to acknowledge that a lot of this was done in partnership. All of this was done in partnership with him. So I just want to make sure that was said. Okay.
Yeah, I mean, and this is a moment it's in the wake of institutions being formed and set up and funded. So I think it'll be interesting to watch both the opportunities that are enabled by institutions and this funding, but then what starts to happen outside of them as well.
Yeah.
Great. Well, thank you so much for sharing your expertise, for sharing your knowledge and the knowledge of all these other scholars that have contributed to the book. I'm happy to promote your book, so hand it over.
It matches your clothes.
It matches our institute and everything else that we published it. So do find it, Reorienting the Middle East, Film and Digital Media, where the Persian Gulf, Arabian Sea, and the Indian Ocean meet. So thank you, and thank you so much again to Kate for being here and for helping us work together with the Middle East Institute. It's been a pleasure to work with you and put this on together. So thank you. And thank you all for coming.